What positions are likely to be the Falcons' biggest needs next year in 2024? And which former Falcons am I kidnapping from the past to complete this year's roster?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who are going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And guys, we thank each and every one of you for making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers and follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, as we kick off this sort of laid back holiday week, so to speak, we're doing a Monday mailbag, and you can stick around to the end of today's episode so that you can find out how much of a psychopath I am, because there's certain animals that I want to make extinct or whatever. But, to get the full context of that conversation, stay tuned to the end of the episode. But we'll start things off talking about this Atlanta Falcons team. We got a couple of questions. Our first question comes via Lennox McAfee on Twitter at ATL DirtyBird65. He asks, "Hey, Aaron, love the show, and you're the man. Let's say Desmond Ridder is average to above average next year, and we win 10 to 11 games and win the division. In this scenario, I can't imagine Atlanta looking for a quarterback going into the offseason. What do you think will be our biggest needs going into 2024? In other words, where do you see us being weak this year?" And then I have another Twitter question from Ritter Season at Dirty Bird Report. He has, "If you had to pick any non-Julio or Matt player to add to the current day Falcons, who would it be?" So the answers to both of these questions kind of overlap. So as for needs, I kind of look at a true deep threat number 2 wide receiver as the sort of final piece on the offense potentially, and sort of that alpha edge rusher, that double digit sack guy on the defense as potentially the final piece. Of course, there's so many other positions that over the course of this, next 6 months could emerge as bigger needs. But those would be the two I would guess ahead of time would be the best bets. Cornerback could also be very high on the priority list, especially if Jeff Okudah does not have a successful season to get that sort of bronze medal as the team's biggest needs. But, for me, adding that sort of Will Fuller type of speed threat opposite Drake London to me is kind of the final piece for this offense. And, I think, assuming Arnold Ebiketie doesn't develop into that alpha pass rusher, getting that guy makes a ton of sense. And so if we're applying, in terms of adding former Falcons, if we're applying the Bill and Ted rules, meaning that we can sort of time travel and kidnap those guys from their primes, if I'm not allowed to take Julio, who's obviously, one of the most explosive receivers in NFL history, and so clearly would fulfill that element in this team's offense, I'd probably go back to 1998 and kidnap Tony Martin. Tony Martin's probably one of the great one-hit wonders when it comes to the Falcons, although technically he did return to Atlanta in 2001. But he's one of those players. Like, that would be an interesting conversation. Maybe not this summer, but next summer we might sort of look at the top one-hit wonders for the Falcons, the players that only played like 1 or 2 years but had big impacts in those years. And I'm betting there will be a lot of like 1998 players on those teams, as well as like 2016 players and whatnot. But anyway, Tony Martin definitely would fulfill that role of what I'm talking about, which is, really a number 1, but a number 2 type of receiver that could take the top off a defense. For edge rusher, I think the obvious choice would be John Abraham, arguably the greatest pass rusher in Falcons history that's not named Claude Humphrey, at least in the modern NFL. But just to throw a curveball, because Ryan Nielsen wants bigger defensive ends than what John Abraham was, let's go with Patrick Kerney, right? That would be my pick for who I would kidnap. So let's go back to like 2002, where Patrick Kerney was playing in Wade Phillips's 3-4 defense. We'll talk a little bit more about Wade Phillips's 3-4 defense later on today's episode. And he was like around 275 or whatever he was then, and got like 10 and a half sacks that year, playing in the 3-4. So that would be sort of my pick for one alpha edge rusher that I'd probably kid back from Falcons history. So we will continue today's Locked On Falcons, answering more listener questions, including whether or not Desmond Ridder is going to be the Falcons quarterback 5 years from now. And in the process of that, we'll talk about, which current Falcons may have the best chances of being on the roster come 2028. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But just like the Atlanta Falcons, you may have a small business, or you may be a hiring manager, and you know that your success in 2023 all depends on what team members you surround yourself with. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, where you can quickly attract and hire qualified candidates by matching with people who have the skills, values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. Think of it like a football team where you're trying to make the playoffs. You'd love to find the right quarterback or playmaker to help you achieve that goal. So put your free job post in front of over 800 million member profiles and find the most qualified candidates with LinkedIn Jobs. It's easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs is going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So our next question on today's Monday Mailbag episodes comes from Brian at your homie Brian on Twitter. He asked, do you predict Desmond Ridder will still be the Falcons quarterback 5 years from now? No, not really. I just don't know if the odds are directly in that favor for Desmond Ridder still be. There's certainly a chance that he could be there. It's not like a small chance or anything like that, but it's the odds aren't pointing in that direction. It's hard for any quarterback to be with the same team for more than 5 years, especially, non-first round picks, where you have a financial stake in. And so really, if I was, it's hard to, I generally don't try to project things more than 2 or 3 years in advance. Obviously, when we do the scouting reports on the draft picks, I will try my best to sort of project what I think a player has the potential to develop into 4 or 5 or more years down the road. But, in terms of actually making predictions and whatnot, is hard to do. But right now, probably the only player that I could sit here on this roster and feel comfortable, if you gave me the odds, predicting to still be on the team come like 2028 in 5 years, would probably be Bijan Robinson. And even that is like tenuous, because if you look back at the running backs taken high in the draft, like say in the top 20 picks, going back to the latest CBA when we had the current rookie contract structure, 7 running backs have been taken in the top 20 picks. About 71% of those guys, 5 out of the 7, did play 5 or more years with the team that drafted him. They averaged about 4.7 years, although that number is dragged down a little bit by Trent Richardson, who got traded from the Browns in his second year. And if you remove Trent Richardson from the data set, that average would be about 5.3 years. And now if you go all the way back to 2000, top 20 running backs averaged about 5.5 years with their teams, and about 68% of those guys made it to year 5 with the team that drafted him. So those are the odds that basically, historically speaking, you can project Bijan Robinson as a first round pick to probably play 5 or 6 years here in Atlanta. But other than that, like, again, there's certain players that I feel reasonably good will get second contracts, Kyle Pitts, Drake London, AJ Terrell, or whatever. So they'll have a chance to potentially play that long. But in terms of making these projections about who's going to still be a Falcon, there's so much turnover in the league. You know what I'm saying? So if I was to bet, other than Bijan, I'd probably bet Younghoe Koo, just because kickers have such longevity. And in 5 years, he'll only be 33 and presumably could theoretically play like another 10 years in the league if he has the sort of longevity that other players have. But we'll just sort of have to see about that. So I hope that answers your question, Brian. Our next question comes from Lance Lehman on Twitter at Arrow Lance. He says, who was better, Patrick DiMarco or Bob Christian? And so Christian was the more skilled fullback, right? Christian was a legitimate threat as a runner and receiver. So that makes him probably better all around skill set than Patrick DiMarco was. Our next question comes from the Discord from St. Jimmy. He says, if you had to pick one draft pick over the last 5 years to do over, who would it be? It'd probably be Quinn Miners over Jalen Mayfield. I feel like that's the one pick over the last 5 years where the Falcons had a bad process, right? Rather than just complaining, as we often do. Like, for example, the TJ Watt versus Takk McKinley stuff, that wasn't a bad process, hot, spicy take. I don't think the Falcons process in taking Takk McKinley over TJ Watt was a bad process. They just didn't get the result that they wanted. And so oftentimes when people want to redo these draft picks, it's just based purely off of let's get a better result. And, my philosophy is like, if you put a player in a different environment than what he was, you're probably not going to get the same result as he was. Like, not to say that TJ Watt would have been a bust if the Falcons had drafted him, but he went to a perfect situation in Pittsburgh. And so you got the best version of TJ Watt. And the idea that TJ Watt, if he comes to Atlanta, for example, like the Falcons would want him to maybe put on 15 pounds and maybe he's not as explosive a pass rusher because of that or something like that. And so therefore the idea that you can just sort of swap results by just doing over the draft pick, I don't really believe in that philosophy. So Miners over Mayfield to me was a bad process because the Falcons needed an immediate impact left guard and not a project like Jalen Mayfield. And someone like Quinn Miners, although, like all NFL players and especially offensive linemen, has taken some time to get ready. Miners to me was much more pro ready than Jalen Mayfield and a much better fit in what the Falcons want to do offensively than Mayfield was. But our next question comes from the Discord as well, from Spacebar. Our next two questions come from Spacebar and Discord. He says, first one is, I've always been curious, and maybe you could do an episode on this, and don't ever suggest that I can do an episode. It's a 3-minute segment tops. But why would you play a 3-3-5 nickel front over a traditional 4-2-5 alignment? And would either front change what you do in the back end, or does alignment of the front run independently from what coverage you're going to play in either situation? I'm not as knowledgeable about the intricacies of the 3-3-5 because it's primarily a college defense. And so, you may be better off asking like Locked On Auburn's host, Zach Blackerby, to get his answer. But from what I understand, the idea of the 3-3-5 is you're getting more speed on the field to deal with the prevalence of spread defenses or spread offenses in college. Like you're basically subbing out like a D tackle for a linebacker so that you can get more speed on the field. And as far as I'm aware, there's no particular reason why having that front would affect your coverage. So that, maybe other people have a little bit more insight into how fronts affect coverages, but to me, I can't think of a reason. So I hope that answers your first question, Spacebar. Your second question is also, the prevailing wisdom at the moment is the 4-3 fronts are used more in a penetration type of scheme versus 3-4 fronts being used to hold your gap. Could you go into a bit more detail in why this is? Also, are there 3-4 schemes that are more penetrating and 4-3 that hold your gap? I know defenses use multiple fronts. I'm just curious why this wisdom exists, and is it still valid with everyone being multiple in their front usage? Yeah, I mean, this was the old school distinction. It's less of a distinction today because of the hybridization that you're speaking to. But, back in the day, the 4-3 was a one gap scheme. Basically, this is what answers your question. The 4-3 is a one gap scheme where the defensive linemen are responsible for a single gap, and a 3-4 is a two gap scheme where the defensive linemen are responsible for two gaps, right? And as you can guess, right, if you're in a 4-3, you can penetrate your gap, you can attack your gap and penetrate and disrupt through it and still not necessarily be a liability there. And so it was much more of an attacking style of defense, while 3-4, you can't really penetrate one gap because you're abandoning the other gap. So you kind of have to hold the point of attack, read what's happening on a play, and then react based off of the direction of the play will determine sort of which gap should be your primary gap. Now, Wade Phillips, as I mentioned earlier, is probably one of the more famous examples because this century, with coaching in Houston with JJ Watt and the Rams with Aaron Donald, ran a 3-4 scheme, but was much more of a one gapping penetrating style of scheme because people were at the time were like, oh, you can't two gap with JJ Watt. You'll buff your greatest strength. And same thing with Aaron Donald. And it's like, okay, well, he just kind of hybridized and we're going to play more of a one gapping style with a 3-4 front. And so I hope that answers your question. As for a 4-3 scheme that two gaps, the 4-3 under, that we used under Dan Quinn and may wind up using under Ryan Nielsen usually doesn't do this, but it can. Like, you can have your one tech nose tackle two gap, like a 3-4 nose tackle would, who's a traditional zero technique. And you can also have your strong side defensive end in a 4-3 under two gap at times, because he'll often line up in the same way in a 4-5 technique as a 3-4 defensive end does. So that could be one wrinkle, but you would have the other players often one gap opposite those guys. But that's one wrinkle that teams have done in the past. I know Seattle did that a little bit over the years when they had like Brandon Mebane and Red Bryant in those roles. But what you see more common today, especially with the rise of the Vic Fangio and Brandon Staley style defenses, especially with the lighter boxes that teams are playing, is you'll have teams play more of a gap and a half, where a player will be primarily responsible for one gap, but also have like secondary responsibilities for a second gap. So it kind of balances out the two things. Like, you still allow players to be aggressive, but they can't be so aggressive that they completely abandon their gap. So it requires a little bit more discipline. And so that kind of speaks to the hybridization, where it's like, okay, well, we're not one gap, we're not two gaps, so we'll be a gap and a half. We'll split the difference. So that's kind of where teams are going now, especially with the more prevalence of lighter boxes as a way to stop, the explosive passing game against the pass, and playing with lighter boxes against the run. So hopefully that answers your question, Spacebar. And coming up on today's episode, we'll talk all about why I am a psychopath and why koalas and other animals do not deserve to live. And we'll break that down on the rest of today's episode. But tomorrow, if you are an everydayer, again, shout out to you guys. You will be tuning in to Alan Stirk, my guest, joining me to do a Matt Ryan retrospective and talk specifically about, whether or not Matt Ryan is deserving of being in the Hall of Fame when he officially retires from the game. Unofficially, it seems like he's out, but we'll see. So that will be a discussion on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So wrapping up today's episode, we have a question from Wombat at WombatHS on Twitter. He asks, do you still think koalas should be extinct? And if so, can you explain how woefully incorrect you are? So again, many of you guys this is going to come out of nowhere, because in 2021, I kind of tweeted some thoughts about certain animals that I don't think, I'm not going to say they shouldn't exist, right? Deserve to be extinct is a strong word, but I don't think the efforts in conserving certain animals should pull back on it. And koalas are one of those animals. Wombat, clearly you're an Australian listener, and I'm sure I'm upsetting the 5 Australian listeners right now listening to the podcast, but you clearly get it, because your name is Wombat. And I know koalas are a big cultural thing. It's like kangaroos and koalas are the two most recognizable marsupials in Australian native species on the planet. I get it. They're cute. Everybody loves koalas. They look so cute. But the reason why I hate koalas is they're super dumb. And, my beef is with these animals. I'm going to talk trash about koalas, pandas, and cheetahs, that these super niche animals that operate specific niches in their ecosystem. I'm sure some biologist is going to come on here and tell me why I'm wrong about this stuff. But look, I've watched a lot of nature documentaries over the last 40 years of my life, and I by no means think I'm an expert, but I'm pretty knowledgeable about, biology and whatnot. I aced biology in high school and all that sort of stuff. There is an alternate reality where I'm doing a Locked On Falcons podcast, but I'm actually talking about real Falcons is basically the point. So it's not like I'm just some random dude on the internet, or at least I don't think so. But Wombat, you get it, because wombats are related to koalas. They're just as cute as koalas, and they're actually kind of badass instead of koalas, not these idiotic, stupid animals that koalas are, that all have syphilis and eat one thing. And it's like, get rid of koalas. Oh no, we're going to have too many eucalyptus trees. And it's like, eucalyptus trees are like part of preventing malaria in the world. So it's really the net positive of koalas eating eucalyptus leaves, I don't know if it's really there. But the other animal is pandas, similar animal. A panda is an apex predator, a bear that basically got super lazy and just decided to eat grass and become a cow. and it makes them so lazy that they don't even want to reproduce. And like, I know I sound crazy saying all this stuff, but like, people are worried about like the Chinese government infiltrating our country through TikTok, but like the most successful propaganda campaign that the Chinese government has had is convincing the world that koalas or I'm sorry, not koalas, pandas are worth saving, right? Like the amount of money spent to get pandas. This is why every time a panda gives birth, it's international news, because oh my God, this animal that kind of is really terrible at propagating its own species. Like we have to do all this work just to get pandas to procreate. And I'm just like, that's just a lot of wasted money, right? We should be spending that money to conserve orangutans, like an actual cool and worthwhile animal and whatnot. And again, I know there's some biologists, there's one biologist listening, like it's not for humans to decide which animals deserve to live and die. And I'm just like, okay, if you say so. I mean, kind of is. And then with cheetahs, and I don't have as big a beef with cheetahs as I do with pandas and koalas, but cheetahs are like, they basically almost died out multiple times throughout their ecological history, right? There used to be cheetahs in North America and they went extinct. That's a hint right there. And then the cheetahs in Africa and Asia almost went extinct, to the point that cheetahs nowadays, I read that they're so inbred that they're actually more inbred than modern domesticated dogs and cats are, which are some of the most inbred animals on the planet. And so it's like cheetahs basically, like, Mother Nature tried to wipe out cheetahs one time before and didn't complete the mission. And it's kind of up to us to kind of finish the job with cheetahs and whatnot. Again, they're cool, they're fast or whatever, but like, oh man, if we wipe out all the like they're just not built to last on the African savannah. Like when you understand like their inability to hunt larger prey, their low success rate because they have to expend so much energy, and then when they do actually get a successful kill, that they are really bad at defending it because they're so tired and so small and so weak that pretty much like a honey badger can scare off any animal, but like a porcupine could scare off a cheetah from its kill if a porcupine was a predator. So it's one of those things where it's like cheetahs kind of suck. So I don't know, guys. I know you're sitting here like, wow, Aaron, this is weird. This is a weird turn for Aaron. He's so reasonable and rational when it comes to other things. I'm being very reasonable and rational. It's just what happens is like you're told about these animals, and then like the more you learn about these animals, it's like these animals kind of suck, and they're like iconic, right? The panda is the symbol of China. Koala is one of the symbols of Australia, and cheetahs are the fastest land animal. It's like, oh my God, this is in the Guinness Book of World Records type of animal, and it's like they kind of suck in real life. So I'm not going to say that they deserve to die, but He dies.
A fair sentence.
Objection,
Do you think
Your
they
Honor.
deserve to die, Mr.
Your
Haley?
Honor.
Answer the question.
Carly,
Did
don't
they
answer
deserve
that
to
question.
die?
Yes,
they deserve to die, and I hope they burn in hell.
So that's kind of describes my feeling on those three animals. So yes, wombat, I do kind of think they deserve to be extinct, and I am not woefully incorrect. I'm actually correct. I'm sure there's one biologist that has the vision that they know that their job is to conserve and love all animals and whatnot, but they know in the back of their mind that these three animals, would you miss them if they were gone? Like, you probably wouldn't. You really wouldn't. Not as much as you think you would. That's my spicy take. So that is where we're going to leave it, guys. We'll talk all about Matt Ryan on tomorrow's episode and whether or not he's a Hall of Famer, as well as some of the other great moments from Matt Ryan's time in Atlanta and what he may be doing moving forward as a broadcaster and what he can bring to the table in that regard. And then later this week, we'll be doing a lot more NFC South content. So stay tuned to see and hear how the various NFC South hosts here on the Locked On Podcast Network, feel about this Falcons team, and you'll get their thoughts on not only the Saints and the Bucks, but also the Falcons. No Panthers content, sorry. I would give a shout out to Julian Council, the host of Locked On Panthers, but Julian, you're dead to me on this. We couldn't coordinate our schedule, so that was not the case. But he's ducking me. He knows I'm coming for you, Julian. Week 1, so we'll get that come up on that one. But make sure you stay tuned to Locked On Falcons here as your first listen, of course, on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL to hear the lowdown on the other 31 NFL teams. And of course, we got the Locked On Hawks going strong. NBA free agency is kicking off. So check out Locked On Hawks with Brad Rowland on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts, to get the lowdown on the latest trades and moves that the Hawks are planning to make this offseason. So guys, that's going to do it for us here. I hope you have a great holiday weekend or week or whatever you're doing this weekend. Yeah, that's it. Appreciate it.